Well, welcome. I'm so glad that you're here. This has been like a dream of mine come true to get this many people in a room who are interested in talking about the Ransom Trilogy by C.S. Lewis. If you don't know why I'm calling it the Ransom Trilogy, I hope that one thing will happen by the end of tonight and that you will know why I call it the Ransom Trilogy and not the Space Trilogy. But this is an introductory talk. So if you're here and you're like, I'm on the fence, I don't know if I really want to participate in this book club, then you're in the right place. We're going to talk a little bit tonight about who C.S. Lewis was, why he wrote this science fiction trilogy, and what we're going to try and get out of it this summer as we work through it. If you don't already have your book and you have ordered one, Jackson there in the back is happy to get you your book. If you want to buy one or two or three, Jackson can also help you with that tonight when we're done. And as I mentioned already, there is decaf coffee, hot water, and water over here. Feel free at any point to get up and go refill your cup. My plan is for me to talk for about 30-40 minutes, and then we'll have a time for Q&A. That will be the general format for these 7 p.m. Thursday night talks. We'll have 5 of these, including tonight. So tonight's the introduction, and then once in June, July, August, and September, we'll cover the rest of the books in this trilogy, each in their own lecture, except for that Hideous Strength, which gets 2, because it's special. So Thursday nights, we'll gather right here. I'll give a talk, followed by Q&A. If you can't get enough of the Ransom Trilogy and C.S. Lewis, don't worry, there's more. As you might have seen in our communications, there are 2 different, at least, book clubs that you can join to discuss this every week as we work through about 50 pages a week at a time. Right here, Thursdays at 12:30, you can come get your lunch for $10. Wednesdays at 12:30, you can come here, get a wonderful lunch made by our great chef, Jesse Brown. Take your tray of lunch right up to Common Grounds, and from 12:30 to 1:30 every Wednesday, except for VBS week. Do not come here for a book club on VBS week. And in Common Grounds, we'll have a lunchtime discussion. If you're planning to come to that one, it'd be helpful for you to register for that, see me, or go on our website and register for that, just so that Jesse knows how many extra lunches he's preparing. There's also another group that meets Thursday nights at 6 p.m. right here. So every week on Thursday night at 6 p.m., from now until September, at 6 p.m., there'll be a weekly book club discussion group. And once a month, that will go right into the lecture. And we'll stay, the rest of our friends will join us, and at 7 p.m. we'll have another talk. All of that is helpfully presented on these handy-dandy bookmarks. If you don't already have one of these, I've got like 100 of them left over here. So take 2, take 3, give them to your friends. I think they look pretty. And it tells you all of the chapters that we'll be reading each week. And it tells you when the monthly lectures are, when the weekly discussions are, and it'll keep you going. Yes, sir?
Thank you for spilling the coffee on it that I didn't spill on it.
Yeah, that does kind of look like a coffee spill. Yeah. Great. Okay, well, without further ado, we're going to start an introduction to C.S. Lewis and the Ransom Trilogy. And it all starts with a pub and a coin toss. A philologist and a medievalist walk into a bar. No, this isn't the beginning of a corny joke, but it is the beginning of how we come to be standing here launching this book discussion. The philologist in question, that's a type of linguist historian, was J.R.R. Tolkien. And the medievalist was C.S. Lewis. I confess I don't know exactly that this particular conversation did happen in a pub, But it's plausible, since both C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien and all of their friends, called the Inklings, would regularly meet at two different Oxford pubs to discuss their life and literature, either the Eagle and Child, or right across the street, the Lamb and Flag. Now, according to Tolkien's recollection, nearly 30 years after the fact, Lewis, or Jack, as his friends referred to him, Lewis, or Jack, remarked to Tolkien one day in the mid-30s, "Tollers, there is too little of what we really like in stories. I'm afraid we shall try and write some ourselves." Specifically, they were disappointed with the science fiction offerings available to them in their day. They each decided they would try their hand at writing their own science fiction story. And as Tolkien tells it, they flipped a coin to see which of them would write on time travel and which of them would write on space travel. That fortuitous toss-up resulted in J.R.R. Tolkien attempting and abandoning a time travel novel called The Lost Road, whose Atlantis-like island of Numenor migrated into the Lord of the Rings legendarium and became the backstory for his famous character Aragorn. So if you like Lord of the Rings and you like Aragorn, you can thank the result of that coin toss. Lewis, on the flip side, was assigned the task of writing about space travel. So a few months later, Lewis had finished the manuscript of his novel and published it as Out of the Silent Planet. This became the first volume in a trilogy that, as this lecture I hope will make clear, can be referred to as the Ransom Trilogy, the Cosmic Trilogy, the Trilogy of the Heavens, or even Lewis's science-fiction books. But it should probably never be referred to as the Space Trilogy unless you want to make poor old Jack roll over in his grave. For as we shall soon see, one of Lewis's express purposes in writing these books was to banish in your minds forever the mythologies behind the concept of space and replace it with what he believed was a far better term: the heavens. So, let's meet C.S. Lewis. We're actually going to meet 4 Lewises. This substitution of heaven for space is a small example of what I want to argue these books are doing on a much larger scale. Here's the thesis I want to carry through this summer. The Ransom Trilogy is Lewis's imagination doing work that his essays alone could not do. He's replacing the modern mythologies that we have absorbed without noticing, about the cosmos, about the human body, about human progress, about other creatures, with older and truer ones. And for that, this lecture will have 2 jobs. First, I'm going to introduce you to 4 different Lewises that I want you to keep in mind, keep in view all summer. There's the Lewis who is a writer of fiction, a novelist, whose imaginative range is much wider than the Narnia shelf most of us know him by. There's Lewis, the lay Christian apologist, whose nonfiction taught a generation how to think about the Christian faith. Lewis, the scholar of medieval and Renaissance literature, whose day job furnished the cosmology these novels run on. And the Lewis most easily missed, the one who will matter most for our reading this summer, is Lewis the prophet, who saw in the Oxford faculty lounges in the 1930s and the 1940s the seeds of ideologies that would only fully bloom in our lifetimes and in our moment. Once we have these 4 Lewises in view, our second job is to ask why Lewis put so much of his work in fiction in the first place, what he thought the imagination was for, and why he believed a story could carry truths that an essay could not. And only then we'll be ready to start reading the Ransom Trilogy. Now, C.S. Lewis likely needs little introduction to those of you who have been bold enough to come to this lecture. He's best known as the author of the classic children's series, The Chronicles of Narnia, his supposals of Christ's work in another world. Lewis preferred supposals to allegories. Some of Lewis's other enduring fiction works you might have read: The Great Divorce, which is a dreamlike journey of ghosts into hell and heaven, loosely inspired by Dante's Divine Comedy. Or Till We Have Faces, a theologically rich retelling of the myth of Cupid and Psyche. Or the Screwtape Letters, a series of letters from the perspective of a senior demon advising his novice nephew on the strategies of temptation. Lewis was also a great essayist and writer of accessible, thoughtful, nonfiction classics, such as Mere Christianity, which was originally written during World War II as BBC radio broadcasts, radio talks on the fundamentals of the Christian faith for an unbelieving audience. His books Miracles and The Problem of Pain and A Grief Observed remain among the most popular arguments for the plausibility of the Christian faith in an increasingly post-Christian society. These stand among the most enduringly wise and accessible guides to Christian thinking and living of the past century. But Lewis was neither a professional novelist nor an ordained minister. He was an academic scholar who specialized in medieval and Renaissance literature. He taught at Oxford and Cambridge, and his lectures were so well attended, they occasionally provoked jealousy among his colleagues, and even occasionally his friends. His least read books by popular audiences are still highly influential, even if sometimes despised works in his academic field. Here I'm referring to works like A Preface to Paradise Lost, The Discarded Image, or the terrifyingly titled English Literature in the 16th Century Excluding Drama. Lewis was a passionate lover of old books, the ones that have that good smell. And he was one of the most penetratingly insightful readers of Shakespeare, Spenser, Chaucer, or Milton in his century, to name but a few examples. Part of what makes Lewis such a fresh air still to literature scholars is that it is abundantly clear in his writing that he loved the literature he analyzed. He taught as a tutor and a lecturer and wrote as a scholar to invite others in to a world of pleasures in the great books. But then we come to Lewis the prophet. So we've touched on three Lewises so far, the writer of fiction, the lay Christian apologist, and the literature scholar. But to fully appreciate the Ransom Trilogy this summer, we need to become acquainted with this fourth and sometimes overlooked dimension of this man. To be clear, these three books that we're going to read are sci-fi. They are indeed fiction, so they fall into the first category. They are apologetical. They're making arguments about the Christian faith in our world. And they are deeply infused by Lewis's view of the medieval cosmos, the way that the heavens were arranged to the medieval mind. But these books are also unnervingly clairvoyant, eerily prescient. It is almost like Lewis had a crystal ball that he could see the next 100 years coming before him. I've heard people say that it feels uncanny to read these books in the 2020s, even though they were written over 80 years ago. Because throughout this trilogy, Lewis critiques at least two philosophical movements whose downstream consequences few Christian writers of his lifetime saw as they were beginning in their infancy in the 30s and the 40s. The first of these philosophies is the severing of any real embodied connection between one's biological sex and one's gender identity. That logic now goes by the name of transgenderism, and Lewis saw it coming in the 30s and the 40s, long before the culture wars of the latter 20th and early 21st century. And the second thing that Lewis saw and wrote about in these books is the trading of embodied human experience for a technological or virtual one. The logic now that goes by the name of transhumanism. Transgenderism and transhumanism in the 30s and in the 40s. Lewis didn't use those words. They didn't really exist in the popular parlance yet. But he saw the premises of them. And he was writing these stories and several essays at this time from the decade from 1935 to 1945 to critique where he saw these things going. While the rest of the British intelligentsia were rightly horrified by the decline of Weimar into Nazi Germany and the rise of the Third Reich, C.S. Lewis saw right through the fog of Hitler's cultic dehumanization to the philosophical soil that it grew in. The materialist anthropology and value subjectivism then ascendant, then rising up in Western universities. These are the same currents he would name and attack in his essay, The Abolition of Man, in 1943. Lewis was able to see the mustard seeds of the very movements that would dominate the next 80 years of culture wars while they were still yet embryos in the halls of Oxford faculty lounges, if I can mix metaphors. In this respect, Lewis stands a bit alongside George Orwell and Aldous Huxley, two other wartime prophets who wrote science fiction that still gives us images and categories for interpreting the world we live in. You might have read 1984 or Brave New World. But where Orwell and Huxley and other of their ilk write in a tragic register, their dystopias close in on themselves. Lewis writes from a whole different eschatology. He has a different understanding of how the story ends. Yes, it is true, the Bent or Yarsa, Satan, and you'll know who he is later in this series, is real. But he does not have the last word. The heavens and the God who made them have the last word. The difference is not a matter of sharper foresight between Lewis and the other people who could see what was going on, but one of theological conviction. And it gives Lewis something that few other dystopian writers of his day had: hope. Perhaps most importantly, one of the reasons people keep coming back to Lewis, the four Lewises we've talked about, is his deep conviction that the imagination is just as much a valid entry for Christian discipleship as the intellect. I mean, millions of children and adults alike have encountered gospel truths through the Chronicles of Narnia, through the wardrobe door, but have never in their life sat through a sermon or read the Bible. But what about us? Have we graduated from the milk of stories to spend the rest of our lives chewing on the meat of serious rational discourse? Should we graduate from Lewis's fiction to his essays, his grown-up stuff? I don't think Lewis would say so, and neither would I. In one of his most insightful essays called On the Language of Religion, Lewis identifies three major categories of speech. There is ordinary speech, which is more or less how we speak to one another every day. An example of ordinary speech would be, "It was very cold." But there's two different ways that ordinary speech could be improved upon. These are scientific speech and poetic speech. So let's look at three examples. Ordinary speech. Number one, it was very cold. Number two, scientific speech. There were 13 degrees of frost. Or poetic speech. Number three, ah, bitter chill it was. The owl for all his feathers was a cold. The hare limped trembling through the frozen grass, and the silent flock in woolly fold numbed were the beadsman's fingers. Now, number two and number three each represent a kind of improvement on the ordinary speech, "It was very cold," but in two very different ways. Lewis makes clear in his essay that each register is legitimate for its proper job. Scientific speech gives us objective, measurable, reproducible findings, and that's no small thing. His quarrel's not with science, but it's with scientism, the claim that only scientific speech is cognitively meaningful. The problem he's identifying is that without specialized knowledge, scientific speech doesn't actually mean anything to the person hearing it. Think about what it would take for the scientific phrase of, there's 13 degrees of frost. That's an old British way of saying it's 13 degrees below freezing Fahrenheit, 19 degrees. What would it take for it's 19 degrees to mean anything to you? You would have to have lived through maybe dozens of 19-degree days, had that experience, gone out with a thermometer or checked the weather app on your phone, said, it's 19 degrees right now. Made the connection consciously between your experience and this abstract number, 19, and committed it to memory so that you knew when you heard it again, if someone says it's 19 degrees, what it would feel like in your body, and how 19 degrees compares to 16 degrees or 45 degrees. Only then does the precise precision of the scientific language give you anything that means something to you. Otherwise, it's just jargon. On the other hand, there's poetic speech. Far from poetic speech being emotive or expressive, it is precisely the language of experience. By activating the imagination with a bombardment of masses of factual information, poetic speech can reproduce the experience in such a way that it can be imagined vicariously by someone who has, for example, spent their entire life in the Amazon rainforest or the Saharan desert. Even if those pieces of factual information are composed and put together to form a fiction, they are nevertheless built on the accumulated real experience and mental impressions that we store in our memories as imagination. I could tell you that it's so cold when you put your hands in water, it will burn like fire. And even if you've never lived in the Minnesota winter, like I have, and don't know what it feels like for it to be so cold that it burns, if you've ever experienced burning, I can give you that experience through poetic language, through this bombardment of concrete images. Thus, poetic speech is a more potent vehicle for communicating real, concrete, tangible, embodied, experienced truths, precisely because by its nature it involves the imagination. And what it most distinctively transmits is not just the cold or the chill, but the longing or the reaction that those images awaken in us. For Lewis, that longing, what he elsewhere calls joy, is itself an argument, a witness to a reality that the bare prose of theology, science, can only name, but can't impart, can't transmit. So for our purposes, we can expand poetic speech beyond just the realm of poetry per se, to include all forms of descriptive storytelling and fiction writing. Keep in mind that for most of literary history, the highest and most culturally significant form of storytelling was poetry, verse, rather than prose. The dominance of prose fiction is so comparatively recent that, in fact, we still call it by the form the novel, a new thing. And I make this point because the imagination often gets a bad rap among Christians, especially evangelical Christians, of whom I'm gladly a card-carrying member, punches and stamps and all. The imagination is often used dismissively in our context to describe fantasies or unrealities. It's used interchangeably with falsehood or deception or escapism. We praise a childlike imagination. Serious people, we are told, those who live in the real world, face the facts and trust the science. We should devote ourselves to the improvements of scientific speech, empirical, measurable, reproducible, verifiable truths. Or in the more pious version of this way of thinking, we should not waste our times reading fiction, but only the latest devotional or theological books by Crossway or Zondervan. 73 Simple Ways to Be More Anglican, a brief catechism. The Pitiless Eradication of Frenzy, or Temperate and Meek, the Core of the Trinity for Miscreants and Scoundrels. You get the idea. Lewis, I think, has been such an effective communicator by contrast, precisely because he was deeply invested in the poetic, imaginative writing as a medium, he would say, of a real medium of information. He doesn't tell you how you're supposed to feel about a particular truth. According to Lewis, only bad poets are always telling you that something is shocking or delightful. Rather, Lewis believed that the only way to engage the whole person in response to a truth, or the truth with a capital T, is to bombard you with as much fact, concrete detail as possible. And poetic, imaginative literature, like the Ransom Trilogy, like Narnia, like Till We Have Faces, is an excellent vehicle for doing that. To which Lewis would be quick to add, like Paradise Lost, like The Fairy Queen, and like Canterbury Tales, and the list goes on. In other words, it's not as though Lewis the apologist and Lewis the fiction writer are really two different Lewises at all. As one of his closest friends and fellow Inklings, Owen Barfield, once said of him, somehow, what he thought about everything was secretly present in what he said about anything. I'm going to read that one. I love that quote about him. Somehow what he thought about everything was secretly present in what he said about anything. He was a deeply integrated thinker. And there was a serious effort in Lewis's fiction to communicate truth in a way that would be completely impossible in any other medium. Because unless he can be sure that you've had the same experience as him, Lewis knows that it would be very hard to produce the same kind of holistic, emotional response in you that the subject demands. You can't just tell someone to feel scared and expect it to happen. You can't tell someone who is worried to stop being worried and expect that statement to just have magic on them. He writes, suppose that a mother is anxious about her son who is on active service. It is no use going to her with the offer of some drug or hypnotism or spell that would obliterate her anxiety. What she wants is not the cessation of anxiety, but the safety of her son. I mean, on the whole, on a particular wakeful night, she might no doubt be glad of your magic. Nor is it any use offering her a magic that would prevent her from feeling any grief if her son were killed. What she dreads is not grief, but the death of her son. The point here that Lewis is making is that emotions, grief, fear, are a proper response to a rightly experienced object. The emotions are not the point, the experience, the truth is. He says, we are not concerned with emotions. The emotions are our concern about something else. And the language of poetry, story, fiction, as a real medium of information draws on your existing storehouse of images, your imagination, and it saturates your mind with pictures, memories, smells, textures, colors, until it elicits a whole response from you, one that involves your mind and your heart, your intellect, and your affections. And the multi-sensory, multi-pathway nature of this experience makes it sticky. I venture to bet that you will be more likely to remember a particularly evocative scene from Perelandra as we read it this summer than I dare say than you'll remember 3 points from one of Jamie's or anyone else's sermons.
Blasphemy.
And that's not a dig on Jamie or anyone's preaching. That's just what it means to be human. Stories, the imagination, has a way of sticking in our heads. I could remember stories that I heard when I was 8. And I didn't try to. I felt it. I was there in my mind's eye. It is a kind of magic, what imaginative literature is trying to do. And Lewis implores you to remember your fairy tales, that spells are used for breaking enchantments just as much as inducing them. Now, how the imagination works in the Ransom Trilogy. We're going to look at two case studies, and the first is the heavens. So we see this theme of how our lives are shaped by our imagination right from the beginning of this trilogy. Ransom, Dr. Elwyn Ransom, our protagonist, who we're going to follow through about 700 pages, discovers how much his mind has been shaped by the stories that he's read. In just the first few pages of Out of the Silent Planet, Ransom is drugged and kidnapped by two acquaintances, smuggled into their interplanetary spaceship, and he wakes in horror to realize that he's looking at Earth through the window. But as he finds himself traveling through the solar system, he feels a profound change coming upon him. The influence of the radiance of the light through which the spaceship is traveling is invigorating him, strengthening him. It's giving him a new vitality. And he begins to realize that his expectations of what the universe is like have been falsely informed by the stories that he has grown up in. His encounter with the real surprises him with a joyful discovery. A nightmare long engendered in the modern mind by the mythology that follows in the wake of science was falling off him. The very name space seemed a blasphemous libel for this empyrean ocean of radiance in which they swam. Older thinkers have been wiser when they named it simply the heavens which declare the glory. This is one of the major themes throughout the trilogy that we will follow. Ransom must constantly remember the stories that have shaped him, often in subliminal or unconscious ways. Ransom calls it the mythology that follows in the wake of science, in this quote. For indeed, a mythology, a poetic imagination, a mind shaped by stories and images and myths is not optional. It's not whether you will have a mind shaped by stories, but which stories and images will shape and fill your mind. Either our imagination will be filled with the old myths of elves and fairies, gods and temples, titans, angels, talking beasts, and haunted forests, or it will be filled with cold vacuity, utter deadness, with science and empire and technology and machines and progress. Older thinkers had been wiser, Ransom says. The modern stories, despite having more scientific accuracy, are hollow and empty of truth. In this sense, we have the peculiar sense of watching Ransom throughout this trilogy reform his imagination in exactly the same way that Lewis is trying to reform your imagination through these books. This starts with Lewis beckoning us to reconsider whether our imagination of space is in fact telling the whole story, or whether there's a deeper, truer story about the cosmos, the true myth with a capital T and a capital M. And notice what is doing the reforming work in Ransom. It's not a logical proposition, but it's a longing in him. The radiance of the heavens awakens in him a joy he did not know he was missing. The longing is itself for Lewis an argument. It's a witness to the reality that the bare prose of science, of theology, of scientific speech can name accurately, but it can't transmit. The imagination is how that witness gets carried. And what is that reality for Lewis? It is, among other things, the one the Apostle Paul describes in a verse that should be much stranger to us than its familiarity makes it. As Christians, we believe in a personal God who exists primarily outside our ability to see, to hear, to measure, and control. And Paul says, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places." Ephesians 6, verse 12. This is not for Lewis an incidental verse. It is precisely the cosmology that the trilogy is built to try and reimagine for us. Lewis, the medievalist, the man who had spent his life reading books from the 13th and the 14th century, had spent his career inside the imaginative model of the cosmos, of the heavens, that he describes in his last academic book, The Discarded Image. The medieval view of the heavens was one of a hierarchical, populated, layered heaven in which planetary intelligences moved under the rule of God. It was a pre-Ptolemaic universe. It was a Ptolemaic, it's not a Copernican universe. Lewis the Christian recognized in Paul's rulers and authorities and cosmic powers in the heavenly places from Ephesians the same furniture, theologically baptized. The ruler of Malacandra, the first planet we visit in our trilogy, is one of the medieval planetary intelligences that Paul would call the powers. Michael Ward has made the case at book length in Planet Narnia that this is the secret architecture of all of Lewis's fiction, including Narnia. More on that later. The Ransom Trilogy is, among other things, the project of giving us back an imagination big enough to read Ephesians 6 without flinching. And Ransom, despite being described in the narrative as a pious man, has a very limited imagination that these tenets of his faith might actually be true, real. The next case study is other intelligences. Ransom will discover during his journeys that his imagination has been malnourished in more ways than just cosmology. The mythologies of scientific materialism have also populated his mind with assumptions about other creatures. He learns en route that he's being brought to the planet Malacandra at the request of one of the beings on this planet called a Sorn. His mind, Ransom's mind, in Lewis's word, is richly furnished with bogies, twitching feelers, rasping wings, slimy coils, curling tentacles, the inheritance of H.G. Wells in the science fiction of Ransom's day. Lewis's description of what Ransom braces for is worth pausing on. He saw in his imagination various incompatible monstrosities, bulbous eyes, grinning jaws, horns, stings, mandibles, loathing of insects, loathing of snakes, loathing of things that squashed and squelched. All played their horrible symphonies over his nerves. For Ransom's mind was stocked with the images of the science fiction writers of his day. The same mythology that follows in the wake of science, that produces terror, the terror of space, is also responsible for Ransom's certainty that an alien creature must be a monster. And yet consider where that myth comes from. The assumption that the universe is essentially dead and that other creatures must be our rivals and our enemies is the inheritance of scientific materialism. It is not the picture we get from Scripture of a universe created by a good and wise God who made the heavens to declare his glory and populated it by creatures we have not yet seen. When Ransom does eventually meet the creatures of Malacandra, he finds 3 species of rational beings who, like him, were created in the image of God, as God's creatures to know and serve him. But unlike Ransom, they're not from a sinful race that's fallen away from the glory of God. They live in peace and harmony with one another, in ordered ranks under their Oyarsa, their angelic ruler, no less, but in ways that take Ransom and us a very long time to understand. It's hard to understand sinlessness. Throughout the trilogy, Lewis continues to wrestle through a conflict between a rightly ordered hierarchy that is rooted in the character of God and the ways that that vision has been twisted and bent by sinful human beings to justify all manner of evil and injustice. It is not the Sorns, or the Harassa, or the Fiffle-Triggy who are the monsters, but it's the three humans who arrive on Malacandra. And Ransom slowly learns that he doesn't need to be one of them. We fallen humans are the ones who leave death and destruction in our wake. Ransom learns that Earth alone among the cosmos, the silent planet, is the one world that is outside of the fellowship with the rest of the heavens. Earth, or Tholkandra, as it's called by outsiders, was cut off when the ruler of this world rebelled against Malel-Dil, God, the creator and ruler of all. And the bent ruler of our world has made the hearts and minds of the inhabitants of earth bent and broken like him. The God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelievers to prevent them from seeing the glory of God. Ransom arrives on Malacandra with exactly the same sort of attitude that you would expect from a British man born during the end of Victorian England. He walks around with a head full of all the mythologies and stories and snobberies of a posh Oxbridge don living during the twilight years of the British Empire. That is, his mind is steep in all the stories of British merchants and adventurers civilizing the savages in the colonies. He had surely read Robinson Crusoe. And so when Ransom, through no fault of his own, mind you, arrives in Malacandra and encounters the natives, he brings with him a host of prejudices and assumptions of materialist superiority, typical of a man with his imaginative constitution. He even wonders at first whether he, as a good English churchman, ought to undertake their religious instruction. But the Harassa, the first of the Malacandrian races that he will meet, welcome him, teach him their language. It helps that he's a philologist, so he studies languages. But the more time Ransom spends with the Harassa, learning their customs and their society, the more they find him to be very strange indeed. The humans don't seem to know the basic truths about Malel-Dil. They live like they're hurt in the head, they say. Even things that children know about the Creator and his servants, the Eldila, or angels, how to live properly in God's creation, are unknown to the people of Tholkandra. You have poets in your world. Do they not teach you this? The Harassa asked Ransom. Don't your poets teach you? You say you have poets in your world. Do they not teach you this? And Lewis's reply to the Harass would probably amount to, they have tried, but we've stopped listening to them. We don't pay attention to the poets and the storytellers whose imaginations were baptized, the poets from the world before the hollowing out of scientific materialism. If we treat poetic speech or fiction as genuine means of conveying information, then we're steeped in all the wrong kinds of it, the kinds that have abandoned the old ways. So this is why I commend the Ransom Trilogy to you this summer. Lewis had a mind steeped in the medieval imagination, which makes him, despite being a man of the 20th century, a poet-prophet whose stories will cause a holy friction with the vain boasts of our technological age. Ransom was introduced to us in the first sentence of Out of the Silent Planet as the pedestrian. That's how you'll meet him in the first sentence, the pedestrian. And over the course of 700 pages and 3 novels, he's hardly recognizable by the end of that hideous strength. He's transformed from a rather bumbling, a little cowardly, certainly self-centered, but altogether decent sort of chap that we meet at the beginning, and he transforms to be from a thoroughly modern man to someone who might have stepped right off the pages of Sir Thomas Malory's King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. From pedestrian to Pendragon, as one scholar has put it. But first he must become a pilgrim and go on this journey willingly and not as a captive. And so I invite you to let Lewis's medieval view of the cosmos of the heavens work its spell on you to release you from the enchantments of a cold, dead, hostile universe. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork, Psalm 19 says. You will not be disenchanted from the binding chains of the God of this world until you are re-enchanted with the glory of God in the worlds he has made. The worlds. O Lord my God, when I in awesome wonder consider all the worlds thy hands have made, I see the stars and hear the rolling thunder, thy power throughout the universe displayed. That is the vision that Lewis is wanting to enchant you with. Of course, Lewis would want me to say that in order to remedy this, we should go straight to the sources of the writers who still lived in a world where the heavens were saturated with God's presence. He would say we should let our imagination be shaped by old books, by medieval and Renaissance literature. Lewis would say that for every C.S. Lewis book you read, we should read one by Milton, or Spencer, or Boethius. If that is too much for you, he suggests, you should at least read one ode to every 3 new ones. I believe it is precisely Lewis's saturation. In the medieval and Renaissance imagination that made him a most shrewd prophet of the century after he wrote these books. He called himself a dinosaur, after all. It was because he breathed a different air than his contemporaries. And it's because he breathed a different air that his nose could sniff out the beginning of philosophical movements that would become the fog in which we live. So looking ahead, this summer we will spend the next 3 weeks reading and discussing Out of the Silent Planet, culminating in a lecture on June 18th, drawn from this first book, on what Ransom learns on Malacandra about what it means to be human. Allow me to make this caveat. While I have grown to love Out of the Silent Planet, my first 2 attempts, I found it really boring. And I gave up on the trilogy altogether, which I lament because I missed so many years of enjoyment. Over the years, I've heard from a few dozen people that they never even made it to Perelandra because they never made it through the Silent Planet. So if you find that happening to you, take heart. I will do my best in the weekly discussions to bring out as much of the good meat and buried treasure in there as I can find. But some people do find it a very subtle book. Science fiction in the 1930s was a very different kind of genre than it is today. And you can always skip it. Go straight to Perelandra if you need to. Because from the end of June and into July, we will read Perelandra, which is, by my unofficial polling, the far and away favorite of the science fiction trilogy, the Ransomiad. And for many people, it's their favorite book by C.S. Lewis they ever read. It really is a very different kind of book altogether. It is a much more fantastical and mythological story. It's essentially C.S. Lewis's retelling of one of his favorite poems, John Milton's Paradise Lost, which is itself a retelling of the Garden of Eden and the fall of Eve and Adam. Perelandra is the most obviously pastoral book for Christian living because it takes us right into the heart of our daily battle with sin and temptation. So on July 16th, I will give us a lecture on what we can learn in Perelandra about sin and temptation. For those of you who have read and loved the Screwtape Letters, you will find this to be a very close companion. In fact, C.S. Lewis is writing it at the same time. He often did this. He has a fiction book and a less fiction book that he's working on at the same time. He's getting his ideas out through all the channels. Finally, through the second half of July through August, we will read and discuss one of the least read, but probably most prophetic of C.S. Lewis's writings, That Hideous Strength, loosely inspired by the Tower of Babel. This book is a devastating critique of technocratic bureaucracy. Drawing on themes from the previous 2 books, it's a story of the rise of a sinister agency, the National Institute of Coordinated Experience, the NICE, who, despite pretending to be a nice institution of human progress, are in fact playing with dark spiritual forces beyond their wildest imagination. It is a darker book than the other two. I'll have 2 lectures, one on August 13th on what that hideous strength has to say about how we should relate to technology. And finally, on September 3rd, I'll conclude with a final lecture on that hideous strength that also incorporates the most famous essay that Lewis wrote alongside it, The Abolition of Man. That is considered by many readers to be one of Lewis's, if not the 20th century's, finest philosophical essays. It'll only take you about an hour to read it, but about 20 years to get it. I'm still working on it. With all these lectures, I'll do my best to give you all the information you need to follow along. So even if you fall behind on the reading or have no time or interest at all, please do come along. Maybe the lectures will spark your interest to dive into the stories if you haven't already. Or maybe you'll just be glad to have a few of Lewis's images transplanted into your imagination from the talks alone. All of these talks, I hope, will be recorded and available on the website. And after each of our talks here, we'll have a time for discussion. In addition to, there's the option of the weekly discussion groups. So let me close where we began. Lewis the prophet could see the future and communicate it to us so clearly as Lewis the writer of fiction, because Lewis the medieval scholar was a dinosaur who lived in the past, and Lewis the Christian apologist understood why it mattered for living lives fully under the rule of Christ as Lord of the heavens. All 4 Lewises are doing the same work. At the end of Out of the Silent Planet, Ransom says to the fictional C.S. Lewis, the character who makes a short cameo entrance as our narrator right at the end of Out of the Silent Planet and the beginning of Perelandra, if we could even effect in 1% of our readers a changeover from the conception of space to the conception of heaven, we will have made a beginning. So that's the beginning I'm inviting you into this summer. You have now been initiated into the ranks of those who understand why the publishers who persist in calling these books the Space Trilogy clearly have never read them. So I'll leave time at the end of these lectures for questions and discussions. We'll do this in just a moment, but I do hope you enjoy your time with Ransom this summer. I keep returning to these books again and again and find them to continue to challenge and strengthen me to live in wonder and in hope that the God who created the heavens and the earths for his glory and our joy invites us in. Let me pray for us and then I'll take some questions. Our Father, we thank you for the gift of your world. We thank you that the heavens are telling your glory. Would you give us an imagination that is so steeped in your word and in your world that we cannot help but have our hearts be surprised by joy. Thank you for our brother, Jack, and the ways that you uniquely gifted this man to care about old things to help us understand new things. And I pray that this time we have together would be a time that we would enjoy not only C.S. Lewis, not only these great books, but we would enjoy each other. And that friendships would form as we have inside jokes about random characters and scenes from these books, but that you would build and knit us together into a worshiping community. For your glory and our joy, we pray. Amen.